Okay, so last time we were talking about U.S. imperialism, the race for resources. This is where the United States is expanding its borders beyond the continent of the United States. We're looking to get out in the Pacific. We're looking to get out into South America. We talked a little bit about what makes an imperialist nation, and we said one of the key parts is that you have to have a strong military presence, specifically a strong navy. So let's talk about some specific examples of where we see the United States implementing its navy and trying to gain access to more territories. Remember, more territories, more resources, more money. This is right in the middle of the Second Industrial Revolution. So all this expansionist policies and all this efforts to gain more territory is going to help with industrial efforts as well. All right, let's take a look at some local history here with William Seward. In 1867, William Seward was our Secretary of State. So his job is basically to deal with foreign nations. He's going to make trades, he's going to make deals. Of course, he has to bring those deals back, and Congress can then vote on them. But Seward is essentially the guy who's going to be dealing with foreign countries. And Seward comes up with this great deal with Russia, and essentially Russia agrees to sell Alaska for $7.2 million, which in today's money, I don't know, but it's pretty much practically next to nothing. It's a really good deal. We gain a huge chunk of land. And initially, though, Seward was criticized for this purchase because what are we going to do with Alaska? It's this giant chunk of land up in the Arctic Circle. It's this frozen, barren wasteland. People thought Seward was nuts. It was nicknamed Seward's Folly. People were also giving it nicknames like a Polar Bear Garden and Seward's Icebox. And years later, though, they found like coal deposits. They found gold off the coast of Alaska. It would prove valuable for fisheries. So this was a huge chunk of land. It basically, adds plenty of like resources that we need for industry, increases the size. Alaska turned to be a pretty big purchase for us. Let's do this. There we go. So just to kind of put in perspective of where we are in the world here, this is, of course, is the United States. Here's Canada, and then this is Alaska. This is Seward's Folly. You can see it's right next to Russia. It also helps put the United States further out into the Pacific, which was kind of like the United States goal throughout the mid-1800s. We're always looking to establish our empire, expand our territory out into the Pacific so that we can gain access to the valuable trade markets throughout Asia. So Alaska's kind of putting us in the right direction. And we were also looking to get involved in Hawaii to further our presence in the Pacific and to get us closer to the trade markets in Asia. We start out with the Midway Islands, but they're really small, and it's hard to gain sort of an economic foothold or expand your empire if all you have is just a small set of islands. So Hawaii becomes really important. Initially in the 1790s, we start to do some small levels of trade. We have some missionaries that are looking to expand Christianity and religion out that way. And then in the 1830s, 1840s, sugarcane starts to become a very profitable market. Sugar is a very valuable commodity, and Hawaii has really conducive geography, climate, temperature, the whole nine yards for growing sugarcane. So United States business interests start to develop sugarcane in those regions, and they're also going to use the local Hawaiian population for the labor for that mostly. You're also starting to see the emergence of fruit companies starting to be developed in Hawaii as well, such as think of Dole Fruits. By the mid-1800s, like the late 1800s, 1870s, 1890s, now the fruit companies have been there for several decades, and they're really starting to gain political and economic control. And they don't have complete control. Hawaii is still ruled by a queen. The queen, her name, let me get this right, Liliuokalani, nailed it. She was still technically in charge of Hawaii, and this didn't sit well with the fruit companies. They couldn't quite do as much as they wanted to do in terms of exploiting the country for its labor force and take advantage of the fruit companies. So Hawaii still has control, and Dole is doing whatever they can to push them out. And these are like your wealthy industrialist types. Sanford Dole is like the equivalent of like Carnegie and Rockefeller, except in the fruit business. And Dole is actually able to use the United States military to sort of overthrow or dethrone the Queen, and he does all this without the U.S. government permission. So after they get rid of the Queen, they set up this provisional government. Then for the next few years, they're kind of going back and forth in the U.S. Like, should we actually be trying to take over basically a foreign country? Should we annex? Should we add Hawaii to the United States as a territory? Back and forth, the presidents went, and eventually by 1900, it falls under the, yep, we're going to annex it, we're going to make it part of the United States. And eventually in 1959, Hawaii becomes a state. One of the big reasons why the United States government shifts its position from like, let's not quite take it over fully to, yeah, we really need this, is the events that took place in 1898, the Spanish-American War. Again, with Alaska, Hawaii, here's Alaska, here's Hawaii, Midway Islands, or a small set of islands are here. This is going to allow us to establish our naval bases, those coaling stations. Remember, you can only go as far as your Navy will take you. So going from the United States to Hawaii, you can refuel, hit the Midway Islands, refuel, and then from there you can kind of get out into the rest of the Pacific, specifically the Philippines, getting into China and other markets like Japan. Thank you, Matthew Perry, 1854. So this is really valuable territory to start establishing a military presence and an economic presence in the Pacific. Speaking of economic interests, China, huge economic interests, valuable markets. People for hundreds of years have been trying to tap into this China market, getting into China through Europe, like coming from this way. You have these mountain ranges, it's very rugged terrain. The easiest way to travel is still by boat. So for the United States to get into China via the Pacific, this is going to be a huge resource for the U.S. to be able to tap into China and trade to the Chinese markets. Okay, I've kind of made some additions to this very famous political cartoon depicting throughout the 1800s a lot of different European nations and Asian nations as well were imperializing China. They're basically setting up shop, they're stronger, they have bigger, better armies, better military. They're basically exploiting China, who at the time was not as technologically advanced, not as industrialized. So the bigger European countries could basically have their way with China. And in this cartoon, you have some different nations represented by the different characters. This would be the Queen of England, this is Germany, this is Russia, this is France, and this is Japan. And in the background here you have China. And again, these are all like very stereotypical, slightly racist, especially the Chinese character, racist depictions of these different nations. But what they're doing is they're taking knives and they're basically cutting up what looks like a pizza or a pie, and on it says China on it. And they're basically deciding who's going to get what parts of China. And then I've added here my depiction of Uncle Sam, because the United States certainly wants to get in on the China trade. Europe has been in there throughout the early part of the 1800s, in some cases earlier. United States, we get in the game kind of late. The whole imperialism thing, it's kind of relatively new. We're starting to pick up our imperialism game in the 1850s. So the U.S. wants in on this, but just like in any scenario, you show up late to the dinner table, you might not get the best pieces of meat, or you're looking at leftovers. So the U.S. is kind of scrapping here, trying to get in on the China trade. So what do they come up with to gain what's called these spheres of influence? Each of these different shaded regions represent the section belonging to a specific country. So Britain's sphere of influence, this zone where only Great Britain can trade, only Great Britain can deal with economically with China. France, Germany, anyone else, they cannot come into these specific zones. So notice the United States is not in any of these shaded areas. They do not have a strong presence or a sphere of influence. Their little political economic zone that they... Okay, so China being this huge market that the United States wants to tap into, we don't have our own little sphere of influence for the United States. So how do we get in? How do we get a piece of that pie that is China? Secretary of State John Hay proposes what's called the open door policy. The open door policy is basically saying, like, let's treat China with open doors. Let's not have these spheres where it's closed off to other countries. Let's open up all of China so everyone has spheres of influence throughout the whole country. That way everyone can benefit from trade across the entire nation. It's not just like, oh, Great Britain has this zone and only this zone to trade in. No, Great Britain can come down to the coast here and they can trade in the French zone. The Japanese can come into the British zone and vice versa. Everyone can benefit from this open door policy. The other point that Hay was arguing with his open door policy is that it's going to reduce the amount of tensions and threats for potential war. If you have these like zones, these spheres of influence, then it could lead to tension where, hey, we're Great Britain and France, you're not allowed into here. Why are you trading in our zone? That could lead to tensions. That could lead to military conflicts between these industrial nations, and no one likes to go to war. That could lead to a lot of bad things. So Hay's proposal for the open door policy is kind of met with some skepticism, but in 1900 we have the Boxer Rebellion. Basically, the group of people in China known as the Society of Righteous Fists of Harmony, known as the Boxers. These guys were like really into martial arts and stuff. They had this uprising to try and get rid of the Western powers. So all the industrialist countries that were imperializing, the Chinese people were fed up with it, and they tried to basically revolt and kick out the foreigners. This didn't go over so well because part of their beliefs was that, you know, their religion, their beliefs was that, you know, they were immune to bullets. And, you know, when you have modern military versus farmers with pitchforks who feel like, you know, bullets cannot harm them, you can imagine that this did not go well for the Boxers. And the United States played a pretty prominent role in putting down this rebellion, which showed to the rest of the world and China that they're really serious about their commitment to the Chinese trade, Chinese markets, and establishing and keeping this open door policy intact. And then after the put down of the Boxer Rebellion, which scared a lot of the European industrialist nations, this led to sort of a second open door where finally the rest of Europe is kind of on board with this idea, and this is what really allows the United States to tap into the Chinese markets. So their conquest from like Alaska to Hawaii, the Midway Islands, and then eventually into China. And of course, in 1850, we already had opened up trade with Japan. The United States is becoming a really prominent player in the imperialization of the Pacific. And it's really putting us on the map. European nations are really starting to notice that the United States is like the new up-and-coming empire that they really need to start thinking about and contending with in the future.